With respect to the evolution of consciousness notion of time acceleration, we see in Middle History, a tightening of events, a quickening of the universe's advance to greater awareness. This is Session 6, Middle Ages, in a course titled, History as an Evolution of Consciousness, and that is an aspect of a larger view, Evolution of Consciousness Theory. In this session, we look at a time on Earth familiar to most of us, the medieval. The period historians call the Middle Ages began with the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and stretched between the 5th and the 15th centuries. Historians generally break the Middle Ages into three periods: the early, 400 AD to 900 AD, the high, 900 AD to 1200 AD, and the late, 1200 AD to 1400 AD. The beliefs, customs, practices, and works of the Middle Ages are referred to as medieval. The early Middle Ages, also called the Dark Ages, opened with the Byzantine Empire out of Constantinople, in control of the Eastern Roman Empire, and with incursions by tribal peoples into the Western Roman Empire, which in the absence of Roman authority had fragmented into city-states. Climatically cold, the period's fragmentation was accentuated by changes in agricultural production. To provide economic stability, the aristocracy and the Roman Catholic Church in what would become Europe, introduced a system of central control that would dominate economic life in the West for almost 1,000 years, seigneurialism. As we described in our course on economics of fulfillment, in this system, a lord, or seigneur, headed an agricultural unit of production and consumption, or a farm or farming region, that could meet the needs of its workers and overseers, with limited trade and outside interaction. Through the power of an armed enforcing body, the seigneur judged, punished, and directed the actions of those under his jurisdiction, the peasantry, who worked the land. The early Middle Ages also saw the birth of a new religion, Islam. Revealed in a vision of the biblical archangel Gabriel, the tribesman Muhammad, 570 AD to 632 AD, spread a monotheistic message of social justice and the Last Judgment, called the Quran. Though influenced by the teachings of Moses, Jesus, Zoroaster, and other earlier visionaries, Muhammad proclaimed himself to be the last prophet, and that his message from God superseded all that came before. In what was once the unassailable Roman Empire, the early Middle Ages ended with Viking invasions from the north, Muslim invasions from the south, and Magyar invasions from the lower Danube. In contrast with the turmoil of prior centuries, the High Middle Ages was a period of cultural, artistic, and intellectual achievement. The comparatively cold climate of the Dark Ages had given way to a period of warmth not seen since the Roman Empire. As significant, the achievements of the High Middle Ages were made possible by feudalism. Unlike seigneurialism, which is between lords and peasants, feudalism is between nobility. In classic feudalism, lords contractually grant land, or fiefs, to barons, who raise the armies needed to secure a territory, or to drive off an invader. The High Middle Ages also saw the Pope as the unequivocal head of the last vestige of Roman dominance, the Roman Catholic Church. The reach and authority of the Church tied the cities and kingdoms of what would become Europe into a cohesive social and economic unit. Papal dominance led to the founding of schools, and of the first universities in Europe, which offered degrees in law, theology, and medicine. Literature and philosophy flourished with the works of Dante Alighieri and St. Thomas Aquinas. Architects perfected the Romanesque style, which with French and Spanish influence, evolved to become the Gothic style. Europe's military power under feudalism, and its cultural integration under the Church, had another outcome. They made possible the Crusades. Initiated to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control, and in response to the conquest of Syria and Palestine by Islamic Turks, and to procure territory for land-hungry barons, The First Crusade was launched in 1095, when European armies joined with the Byzantine Empire, to annihilate the Islamic Turkish army in Anatolia, and take Jerusalem. In 1144, Muslim forces struck back with the conquest of Edessa, and, a year later, the papacy launched the Second Crusade. Islamic Turks ambushed the German army in Anatolia. The French army took heavy casualties in an attempt to take Damascus, and Muslim forces out of Egypt retook Jerusalem. The Third Crusade, 1189 through 1192, was a battle between two of the medieval world's great personalities, Saladin, a Sunni Kurd and first Sultan of Egypt, and King Richard I of England, known to his men as the Lion-Hearted. Defined by sieges, mass beheadings, friendship between rivals, and a struggle between brothers to rule an empire, the Third Crusade left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, and did little to change political structure in the Holy Land. In contrast, the Fourth and Fifth Crusades, and the negotiations that followed, saw Jerusalem repeatedly change hands. In the end, Jerusalem, and Crusader cities and castles in Asia Minor, the Middle East, and the Spanish Peninsula, fell under Islamic rule. By the year 1200 and the onset of the late Middle Ages, history in Europe and the West was poised to embrace a spiritual dimension. In part, this was brought about by the Crusades. In part, it was brought about by a threatening development in what would become China. In part, it was brought about by events at home that were as mysterious as they were terrifying. From the standpoint of the Roman Catholic Church, the Crusades were a military failure. They, however, opened new trade routes, and exposed Europeans to new cultures, new religions, and vastly different ways to think about things. This encouraged what popes and kings feared the most: freedom of thought. Increasingly, people resisted taxation and overbearing government, and, increasingly, they challenged traditional religious ideals and systems of thought. To compound this situation, a threat emerged in the East. To pick up on Chinese history from where we left off, the Qin dynasty, from which we derived the word China, had come into rule in the 4th century BC. Followers of the legalistic school of thought, Qin rulers rejected Confucius, and felt that the only way to overcome anarchy in society was with the power of an authoritarian state. Between 221 BC and 209 BC, Shi Huangti, the first emperor, expanded China's territories, and imposed standard weights and measures, and a standard written language. He also completed the Great Wall, and, to solidify his legalistic ideals, ordered nearly all books burned, and the hundreds of scholars who protested, burned with them. To commemorate himself, Shi Huangti ordered the construction of the terracotta warriors, life-sized statues of 2,000 horses and 6,000 riders, the remains of which were only recently discovered. By the 3rd century AD, opposition to Qin repression had weakened the central government, and, in 206 BC, the rebel Liu Pang seized power and established the Han dynasty. The Han era, which lasted to 220 AD, is distinguished by 3 dynastic periods, each of which financed territorial expansion with high taxes, and each of which ended in rebellion. Despite constant upheaval, the Chinese traded with Rome along the Silk Road and invented paper, the sundial, and the water clock. They also established schools that graded their students using written exams, and along with other subjects, taught Confucianism. By the late Middle Ages, China had advanced through the Sui, Tang, and Sung dynasties. The latter ended in the Mongol, Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty began when an illiterate, skin-clad Mongol named Temujin declared himself supreme ruler of his people, Genghis Khan. Arguably the medieval world's greatest military mind, and assuredly its most brutal conqueror, Temujin led the Mongols across the Great Wall to control China. He and his successors turned west to conquer Turkestan, Afghanistan, Persia, Asia Minor, Kiev, and Moscow, and create an empire that stretched from the China Sea to the Mediterranean. It was also an empire that Europeans feared would continue its westward expansion. China never moved into Europe, but the threat of such was real. Europeans also confronted threats of a more mysterious sort. Historians estimate that the Great Famine, between 1315 and 1317, killed between 30 and 60% of the continent's population. In the 1340s, Europe faced an even more baffling threat, the Black Plague. The Black Plague, also known as the Pestilence, the Black Death, the Great Mortality, or simply the Plague, peaked in Europe between 1347 and 1351. The deadliest pandemic in history, scholars believe that the plague took between 75 and 200 million lives. The trade and cultural interaction that came out of the Crusades, military encroachment from the east, Marco Polo's travels to China, and his service to Temujin's grandson Kublai Khan, famine, and the Black Death, brought a willingness to confront papal authority strong enough to initiate a centuries-long battle between state, church, and citizen. The onset of this struggle was marked by open political discourse, and by the quest for new avenues of spiritual experience. The spiritual movement centered on the search for a direct experience of God, an act once reserved for kings, popes, and those deemed most worthy and enlightened in society. Fueled by fear and misunderstanding, the medieval search for meaning embraced an apocalyptic vision, driven by a fervor for messianic salvation. How is the quickening of the human experience reflected in the medieval historical record? Do we see a pattern to this tightening of events? With our look at the Middle Ages, we complete Session 6, in our course on Civilization's Ascent, from the standpoint of evolution of consciousness theory. Our course titled History as an Evolution of Consciousness continues in Session 7, Renaissance.